Final item of business today is the members' business debate on motion number 4509 in the name of Hugh Henry on the Protection of Workers Bill. This debate will be concluded without any questions being put. Would those members who wish to speak in the debate please press the request to speak buttons as soon as possible. And I call on Hugh Henry to open the debate. 7 minutes, Mr Henry.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The issue, frankly, isn't about a bill. The issue is about freedom from fear that all workers in this country should have as a right. And it's one of the slogans that the campaigning trade union USDA has used over many years, indeed over many years coming into this Parliament and lobbying MSPs of all parties. They cannot understand, nor can the other unions involved, and I'll come to some of them in a moment, they cannot understand why it is that they can hear warm words from politicians, but so little action on an issue which affects so many people. And it does affect many people. From retail crime, which doesn't only affect shops and retail staff, which can actually impact on communities, right across to public sector transport workers, to housing workers and others. And we know that the impact on communities can be quite profound. I remember many years ago meeting a community group from Jackie Bailey's area, which was faced with the loss of the local convenience store because the shopkeeper could not sustain the level of attacks and the level of abuse on staff. And that was a particularly impoverished community, and it's one where the loss of that retail outlet would be very keenly felt. And that story could be repeated right across Scotland. We should have enshrined in this Scottish Parliament that every worker has the right to be treated with dignity and with respect. Every worker should have the right to a working life which is free from fear, free from threats, free from bullying, and free from not just physical assault, but verbal abuse as well. Now, unfortunately, that is not the reality. And some of the latest figures which have been produced are showing a worrying trend. The latest annual retail crime survey published by the British Retail Consortium in January 2012 showed that retail crime in Scotland, across the UK cost shops £1.4 billion in 2010-11. That was a 31% increase. But, you know, money's not necessarily the issue here. More worrying was the reported increase in violence aimed at retail staff. 35,000 had been the victims of physical or verbal attacks or threats, and the number of incidents against employees had risen by 83% on the previous 12 months to a staggering 26 offences per 1,000 employees. Now, the rise was largely due down to increases in incidents of verbal abuse, 13.3 incidents per 1,000 employees. But, you know, verbal abuse can be debilitating and can be shattering and can be life-changing if you're at the receiving end of not just the verbal abuse, but the perceived physical threats that can lie behind it. And indeed, the Scottish Government's Crime and Justice Survey has revealed that 37% of public-facing workers have been abused in the last 12 months, and 10% have been physically assaulted. Unison, the public sector union, conduct an annual survey of violence against public service employees, and that showed that 34,739 staff reported violent incidents in the last year, 7,000 more than in the previous year, and almost 15,000 more than when it was first conducted in 2006. And Dave Watson, Unison Scottish organiser, said that these figures demonstrate an appalling level of violent incidents faced by staff who are simply doing their job. And that phrase can be translated into many areas of employment. The bus workers simply doing their job. And if they're assaulted, then the bus service is lost to a community and that puts at a disadvantage those without motors who rely on public sector transport. The train drivers faced with violence assault, the train guards faced with violence and assault, and the consequent potential loss of service. And we certainly.
Margot MacDonald.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I think what the member has just described is a cultural change, not merely a behavioural change. And if it is cultural, and I'm right, where does it come from and what do we do about it? Because we don't want that embedded in our culture.
Hugh Henry.
Well, I think Margot MacDonald touches on a profound issue which is worthy of a more detailed and prolonged debate than a short members' debate. Because, yes, I think there are cultural issues. There's an acceptance, not just so much about the physical aspects, but there's an acceptance that it's all right to abuse staff. And one of the things that USDA reports every year in the run-up to Christmas is that some members of the public who feel as though they're harassed into buying presents think that it's acceptable to abuse the overworked, the harassed staff who are simply trying to do their job. So, yes, there is a cultural issue there, but for the staff involved, there is a problem that is affecting their health and affecting their well-being. And that's why USDA is so determined to keep its Freedom from Fear campaign going, because they believe that it's right to remind not just the public that this is unacceptable, but they should remind the politicians that those workers need more than warm words. And they cannot understand, and I pose this question without putting forward a specific alternative tonight, but they cannot understand why this Parliament thinks that the law is inadequate in relation to nurses or police officers or doctors, but the law is sufficient in relation to retail staff, to bus drivers, to train drivers, to housing workers and to others. They are merely asking for some consistency. They are asking for the protection that some workers in this country are given because we believe that the law is inadequate. And they are asking why should they not be counted in the same way? Why is that protection and that support not given to them? So USDA will not let up. The other trade unions will not let up. And we will keep hearing this refrain that they want politicians to give them more than warm words. They want politicians to give them something that is actually going to give them some protection when they do their jobs. Thank you.
Thank you. Speeches of 4 minutes, please. I now call John Wilson to be followed by James Kelly.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'd like to congratulate Hugh Henry on securing this worthwhile members' debate. I have known Hugh Henry for a long time, and I know that employment rights and protection of these vital rights is, I know well, one of his priorities. Although I share the sentiment of the motion's aims, the members' debate is not without a sense of déjà vu, since Hugh Henry tried to introduce the Protection of Workers Scotland Bill in the last session of Parliament, and it was unfortunately defeated at stage 1. I know Mr Henry's motion is very similar to the early day motion 574 laid in the House of Commons by Graham Morris MP. It might be a case of where Hugh Henry leads, others follow. I have spoken in the past on Scotland's rich industrial heritage with regards to Workers' Memorial Day. In a modern Scotland, many of the work locations have changed, although the threat of assault, whether it be verbal or physical, is very real. The Trade Union USDA campaign on Freedom from Fear understands that abuse and violence at work is not the same for all. In the workplace today, many employees who work in the retail sector are female, and in the current economic climate, occupy very responsible positions, particularly in small retail shops where alcohol and tobacco is sold. Staff are left on their own, and staff have a duty to challenge in terms of the sale of alcohol and tobacco, and many of those staff members face the threat of verbal abuse and physical abuse because they have refused to serve customers who cannot prove their age. In many of these cases, these staff members are in these shops on their own, and we have to take that away from the threat of physical abuse or violence from those staff members and ensure they work in a workplace free from any violence or abuse. I do not know about other members' experiences, but on many occasions when I go out to the shops, especially, as I said, in the retail sector, it's not unusual that I witness only one or two people managing a shop without any real support on the floor. I know the members' aim and the motion itself believes that all public-facing workers deserve the same level of protection as workers covered by the Emergency Workers Scotland Act 2005. Unfortunately, a distinction was created in 2005, not of my making, and this reality is still in existence today. And I think Hugh Hendry has quite clearly outlined that we have a distinction made for workers in emergency services, but for many workers in the retail sector, they feel they have no protection from the abuse that takes place. The threats that come forward from individuals, particularly, as I've mentioned, in the retail sector, where they challenge people for proof of age. But also we see increasingly workers in the retail sector facing threats because they challenge people who are shoplifting. And it's a serious issue that we have got to address and make sure that workers feel safe and secure in their workplace. Equally, as the motion states, the public have become more intolerant of violence and assault with the decrease in incidents. But as Hugh Hendry has pointed out, the difficulty is that some of the statistics that are now coming out show that in some areas there are increases now taking place. And whether or not that's due to the economic circumstances we currently find ourselves in, it would be difficult to determine. Although it should be remembered that employers also have a duty of care to their employees and should make sure that staff are not and do not find themselves in a situation where they could actually suffer violence and abuse. I would like to recognise the work undertaken by trade unions working in conjunction with First ScotRail for their current public awareness campaign on the railways and congratulate them on their contribution to making the travelling public aware of their campaign. And I genuinely look forward to the day when all workers in whatever sector can carry out their duties without fear of verbal or physical abuse, and I trust we can do all we can do to reach that objective in this Parliament, and look forward to the day we have proper legislation that's enacted that takes forward these objectives that Hugh Hendry has outlined tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call James Kelly to be followed by Mary Scanlon.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I welcome the opportunity to take part in this evening's debate, and I'd like to start by congratulating Hugh Hendry on securing this important debate, and also on complimenting the trade union USDA on the Freedom from Fear campaign, which they have run now on a regular basis at this time of year to coincide with the run-in to Christmas, and obviously a period very, very busy for shops and retail areas. I think it is an important debate because it's an area that impacts on people's lives in communities throughout Scotland, and it is important that as a Parliament we are debating issues and flagging issues up which seek to give out, not only to give out the right signals, but try to indicate the way forward in order to make a difference. Because there's no doubt, as Hugh Hendry and John Wilson have illustrated, that retail and shop workers, do face, very challenging circumstances. There perhaps is a perception that when people go out to work, they do their day and daily chores, they work diligently and they pick up a wage packet or a salary into their bank account at the end of the month. But normal people do not expect to go out to work and, to be assaulted in the course of their duties. But this, unfortunately, happens, day and daily in communities throughout Scotland. We passed many laudable initiatives in this Parliament, for example, on alcohol, things like the Challenge 21 scheme, where we rightly expect, retail outlets to challenge people who are underage. But the reality is that can be very challenging in a cold November night, where maybe nobody is coming out in the local community to the shop, and, suddenly you get 2 or 3 rowdy individuals who are underage and turn up in the shop and then begin to, give the shop worker abuse. That is very, very difficult circumstances. And I think the issue for us as a Parliament in terms of this debate, and Margaret MacDonald touched on this, is how we change that, how we change. There has been a change in culture. And what can we do as a Parliament to get that message across? I'll give way to John Finney.
John Finney.
Presiding Officer, I'm grateful for the member for taking an intervention. I wonder, would he agree with me that the signal that was sent to workers by the cutback in health and safety and the recent report that said that there was little capacity for any proactivity is not the sort of message we would want this Parliament to send?
James Kelly.
Brings me to, when the microphone comes back on, that brings me to my point as to how we take this forward. I think the key thing is to support, in the short term, to support the campaign from USDA on freedom from fear. That gets across the message in the short term in terms of the Christmas period that assaults on shop workers and retailer staff are totally unacceptable. And by getting that message across, we can do a bit at this time to try and change the culture and try and impress upon the public that those attacks are unacceptable. The second point that we can look at is legislation, is by extending the legislation for protection of workers from emergency workers to shop workers. Those points would make a difference. They would make it safer for people to go out and do their jobs. They would make it more secure, and it would not only help those workers, but it would help the economy. It would have less of an impact on the criminal justice system. If we can reduce these attacks, people are not only safe in their shops and in their communities, but people will also feel more bound to come out and to support the shops, support the retail outlets, and give the economy a boost that's crucial at this time. And summing up, Deputy Presiding Officer, I think it's excellent that Hugh Henry's brought this debate forward. I think everybody should get right behind the USDA campaign, and we should look at extending the legislation to shop and retail workers.
Thank you. Now call Mary Scanlon, followed by Graham Pearson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I would also like to thank Hugh Henry for securing this debate and commend him for his consistent and indeed persistent approach to the issue of worker protection. I do appreciate that this is not about the previous bill, but given that I wasn't involved in the previous debate, I hope I'll be forgiven for looking back for some background. So on reading through the official report from 2 years ago, I noted that the Deputy Convener of the Economy, Enterprise and Tourism Committee stated that the committee, and I quote, was unable to access data on the effectiveness of the Emergency Workers Scotland Act 2005, and therefore they could not determine whether the legislation had acted as a deterrent. So I would hope that in moving this forward today, that some further scrutiny on the effectiveness of this Act will be done, or perhaps has been done, to provide much-needed data for future approaches to protect shop workers. The Deputy Convener also mentioned the perception among workers that assaults are not taken seriously by the Crown Office, and this perception had contributed to thousands of incidents going unreported each year. So that takes me to the 83% increase in incidents of violence and verbal assault against retail staff recorded by the British Retail Consortium in a recent 12-month period. I have to say, Presiding Officer, I did find it difficult to reconcile this figure with the decrease in incidents against shop workers, which now stands at less than half the 2004 levels. So after a steady trend downwards, there was a sudden spike upwards. So I think that these figures deserve more causal analysis to understand the sudden increase. And I would agree with you, Henry, that verbal abuse is equally unacceptable. And I think for many of us, we can remember what some school teachers said that certainly made us feel quite humiliated at that time. In the previous debate, the Minister for Community Safety, Fergus Ewing, encouraged people, rightly so, to use the Violence Reduction Handbook, and 5,500 copies had been distributed to people in the front line at that time. The handbook offers practical advice about encouraging employees to report all forms of violence, as underreporting seemed to be recognised as a factor. So whether can I just finish this point? So whether the 83% increase is a more accurate reflection of what is happening due to better reporting, or, even more worrying, if it's an actual increase in violent and abusive behaviour, that does need to be better understood. I'll take the intervention.
John Wilson.
Thank Ms Scanlon for giving way. Would Ms Scanlon accept the proposition that's been put to me on occasion that some workers resist making reports to the police because their employers are not content with making these reports in case they lose, for instance, their off-sales licence?
Mary Scanlon.
I don't know if that is a major matter or not, but I did welcome what Fergus was saying and the distribution of this violence reduction handbook, because I think people do need the confidence to come forward and to report. But those who spoke in the previous debate all agreed that employees need and deserve protection. The disagreement seemed to be based on how this could best be achieved, and that's perhaps where we are again today. My colleague John Lamont stated abuse of those who work with the public is unacceptable, and the Scottish Conservatives agreed with the principles behind the bill. He also suggested we need to be better at enforcing existing legislation. The Law Society stated that existing common law provides sufficient protection to workers who provide the service to the public, as it takes account of aggravating circumstances. So just finally, Presiding Officer, I would like to commend the work that USTRA has done on this issue, and I hope it has helped people to be more confident. I would also commend them on the Respect for Shop Workers Week, which, as James Kelly said, is next week. And I hope that, as James Kelly asked all politicians to work with USDAW, that I can ask USDAW to work with all politicians, because I note here it says, the USDAW briefing note, ask your local Labour politicians to support the campaign, and make sure you invite your local Labour politicians. And I would say to USDA that the best campaigns are undoubtedly those supported by all parties and none. So I hope, and I would certainly be happy to support them. So finally, I thank you, Henry, for this debate, and I hope it has moved forward the issue of worker protection.
Thank you. And I call Graham Pearson to be followed by Nigel Dawn.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. First of all, can I congratulate Hugh Henry, who has worked tirelessly with the support of USDAW to bring these matters to the attention of Parliament and to public notice. And I think I can say from the Labour benches to Mary Scanlon that after her contribution today, I'm sure that she'll be most welcome in terms of supporting the campaign in the future. I've learned through experience that shop workers don't expect a great deal in the working place. They would expect that there should be a reasonable level of cleanliness, that the environment is safe, and that it has been designed to be secure to allow them to work without undue pressure. Employers in these circumstances should be expected to deliver appropriate staff training to prepare them to deal with the challenges that they would face. Working practices and arrangements that are designed to protect those staff when they're going about their lawful duties. And that the design of the workspace should provide secure environments for workers to do their work and do it without threat. In these circumstances, we should acknowledge and bear in mind that many shop staff are working part-time. They're largely low-paid. They generally work very long hours and at antisocial times of the day, of the week, of the month, and over the year at holidays, and all for the convenience of us, the general public. This debate is timely this evening as it leads up to the Christmas rush and the pressures that many of these staff particularly face at this time of the year. In all these circumstances, shop workers and other public servants deserve the support of not only the general public, who need their service, but also shop workers deserve and need the support and the intervention from the police, from prosecutors, from the courts and from this Parliament. We should be delivering the necessary health and safety legislation and background and support the enforcement of current laws, and we should, if necessary, provide new powers if we find that the current arrangements aren't working. And there is a duty on this government to ascertain why there has been an 83% rise in verbal attacks and physical assaults on shop workers, and more importantly, to explain how this rise is possible, going as it does against the wider crime trends which are going in a different direction. These assaults and verbal attacks have a very debilitating effect on staff. Staff do feel vulnerable because very often they are solitary in shops and locations spread across our communities. They are easily identified by those who would verbally attack them and offer violence. They often live in these very communities and feel the pressure of thuggish behaviour and threats day and daily. For minimum wage, these kinds of threats should not be faced by anybody in employment, and certainly not the type of young people and those who have served the public for decades and do it in the best interests of the communities who visit their shops and premises. Shop workers, so many of them young, are at the start of their working lives, and we should be providing them with the confidence to go forward and do better with their future and build a career for themselves. Many of those who work with the young people have worked for decades and again deserve the support of the general public and this Parliament. And I would hope that the Government would bear in mind the statistics that Hugh Henry has brought to our attention today and decide, is this the beginning of a trend or is it a spike? But in any case, it needs to be dealt with. Workers should feel confident in the expectation that they can go to their work, do their shift and go home again without experiencing violence or threats. The trade unions and the Freedom from Fear campaign is an important way forward. It deserves a proper response from this Parliament and, importantly, from this Government. And I support Hugh Henry in the work that he does in bringing this to our attention. Thanks, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. And I now call Nigel Dawn.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and can I join in congratulating Hugh Henry on bringing forward this important debate. I'm sure in 2004 or so, when the 2005 bill was being talked about, that it seemed like a very good idea, and I think we need to be very careful not to rewrite history about that. I'm sure that at the time, medical staff who are often working on their own or working in stressed environments and are often out and about, particularly, for example, in ambulances and the like, seemed like a group of people who needed a bit of support, and I think we can probably endorse that. What we can now recognise, when I use those kind of terms, is that many people who work in shops are in fact very much the same position. They just happen to be indoors. As others have said, many of them are on their own. They feel pretty isolated and they're open to abuse. And so I don't think it's at all surprising that there should be calls for the terms of the medical workers, the 2005 Act, for those terms to be brought into shop workers. I think we can well understand that. But I think the first question that springs to my mind is whether the law of the land is adequate without it. And I think it probably ought to be. I think we've heard views that it is. I wonder whether it's perfectly adequate in substance, but the struggle, as it often is in law, is as a matter of evidence. And in the absence of recording equipment, maybe people working in shops just feel that there's no possibility of bringing the case. Yes, certainly.
Hugh Henry.
I think at the nub of the argument is this debate and dilemma that if the law of the land is sufficient to give workers protection from assault, and many people have argued that it is, then it should be sufficient for police, for nurses, for medical staff. And if extra legislation is required for them, then why not for others?
Nigel Dawn.
I entirely take the point, and I think the answer is that it's very difficult to see quite why that should be the case. But I'm sure it seemed like a good idea at the time. But I think the point that I would like to come to is the one that Margot MacDonald rightly introduced very early on. Because I would suggest to you that where our culture says something is unacceptable, then by and large we don't need law. We do actually need law, for example, to say that murder is unacceptable, because there are some people who are just choose to ignore that cultural fact. But very, very few people do. So where we have a culture that says you shouldn't do something, people will, generally speaking, abide by it. However, where the culture does not tell you that you're not going to do something, I would suggest to you that law is probably inadequate. And maybe that really is the point of this, that there are plenty of environments, shops will certainly be one of them, but there are plenty of communities where the law is not respected. And the culture, therefore, is that you don't worry about the law, and therefore actually changing the law doesn't solve the problem, although it may be a reasonable part of the process.
Margaret MacDonald.
Presiding Officer, at the risk of boring everybody's pants off at this time of night, but it is fascinating what the question that's been raised. And I have my pet theories about it. I wonder if the member shares them. But if it is a cultural change, then there must have been influences have come from somewhere. Where did the influences come from and what were they? I think they came transatlantic.
Nigel Dawn.
I hesitate, partly because we have a relatively short period of time to get into that debate, but I think there's a point there. But I want to go back to my basic point that I don't think the law is terribly good as deterrence. I think we know that. So I think what is being pointed out here is that we need a culture change. Maybe it would be sensible to change the law. I'm sure the Minister will have a view on that. But I would like to suggest that fundamentally what we need is a culture change, which is why we do need a freedom from fear campaign. And we all need to associate ourselves with that and a change in behaviour within our society. But if I might just pick up, if I may briefly, Presiding Officer, I think John Wilson made a very important point in his intervention, because there are small areas of our society, there are communities where it doesn't actually pay to report people to the police. There are certainly circumstances where an off-licence would not want to report things because they think they might lose their licence. And there will be certainly situations where the person serving in the shop doesn't want to report the person who's just come in because they know fine well who they are, they know who they belong to, and they know that in their culture they just don't do that. So it comes back to the fundamental point, I think, that whilst the law maybe needs to be changed, and I recognise the question that Hugh Henry has posed, I suspect that most of what we need to address here is actually culture, and it's important that we do that.
Thank you. I now call on the Minister to respond to the debate. Minister, you have 7 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and can I congratulate Hugh Henry for obtaining this debate. I think that there are certain things with which we will agree right across this chamber, and one of those very fundamental things is that every individual has the right to live their life free from crime and the fear of crime, regardless in what area we're talking about, whether in their own homes, whether they're at work or out in the public domain. So I can say right from the outset and without equivocation that I welcome the aims of the USDAW Freedom from Fear campaign, which seeks to prevent violence, threats and abuse against shop workers. And we all start from the premise that violence is never acceptable. The person who commits a violent act, either physical or verbal abuse, is responsible for their actions. And it is important, I think, to start from that principle. We must have effective criminal laws that protect workers and deter individuals from carrying out such attacks. And indeed we do have, as people have recognised, the protection in the common law of assault. It provides legal protections to public-facing workers and indeed to every single one of us. And let's not forget we are public-facing workers too, albeit not within the terms that the debate is being had as they go about their daily lives. The specific statutory offence provided for in Hugh Henry's bill a few years ago would, as I understand it, although I wasn't actively involved in that committee at that time, would not actually have extended the scope of the criminal law in any way, but would rather have recast the same law and made it into a statutory offence, but wouldn't actually have changed the nature of the criminal law. So I think we're all agreed that laws are only part of the answer. And one or two members, including Margaret MacDonald and Nigel Dawn, have referred to a much wider cultural problem that may need to be addressed. We believe that tackling the underlying causes for assaults is far more important because it will help to reduce the number of attacks, and initiatives to prevent violence have an important role to play. And I do want to come back to them, but I think it's probably appropriate that I pick up some of the more specific points that have been made in this debate, because there are some quite interesting issues here. Like Mary Scanlon, and I'm grateful for Mary Scanlon's intervention, like Mary Scanlon, when I read Hugh Henry's motion, I was slightly nonplussed by what looked like a contradictory set of statistics. So I asked for more background detail on the statistics, and actually, in some ways, the reality raises more questions than it answers, because the 83% increase is a single year-on-year increase against a background of a consistently declining figure from 2004-05. But what is interesting is that it has jumped up and down. And what I don't understand is what lies behind that. So there was a big fall from 04-05 to 05-06. Then it jumped up again, 06-07. Then it dropped back down again, 07-08. Then it jumped up again, 08-09. Dropped 09-10, has jumped back up again, 2010-11. So there is something quite odd going on here, and I think we need to go a bit behind that to find out what's happening. Hugh Henry.
I agree with the Minister on that, and perhaps she could help to answer a question that was put to me today in a phone call. Is it the case that there are statistics which, in relation to violence and attacks on workers, which were kept before 2007, which have been dispensed with? Because I think you're right, we do need to get the figures. So could you check whether there has been a change in the way that information and statistics are being compiled?
I can certainly ask that, although I'm not sure that would still answer this fluctuating kind of thing that's going on here, so that the 58 per thousand incidents in 2004-05 is now 26 incidents, and that's the 80-odd%. Well, I'm trying to think what the original figure was, because that trend is down. But certainly year on year, we get these quite wild fluctuations, and I wondered whether or not what happens is that the figures are high, there's then awareness and a campaign, and then the following year they drop again, and then they go back up again when there's a complacency sets in. There might be something about that, but I do think we need to go a bit further behind those figures, and it is quite interesting to see that. It's an odd graph. And it is quite strange. A number of members understandably raised the issue about the difference between what are currently termed emergency workers, because they were included in the 2005 legislation, as opposed to those wider public-facing workers. Well, of course, that is a debate then, an issue that was looked at, presumably under the previous government, and a decision was made. And I do have a quote from the then Lord Advocate Colin Boyd in respect of this, and people may feel that it's not satisfactory, but it was what was behind the decision at the time to confine legislation to emergency workers. He made the point, and I quote him, that the situation is different for emergency personnel. These workers perform a unique and vital role in our society. The nature of their work renders them and those who assist them particularly vulnerable to attack. When emergency workers are assaulted, obstructed or hindered in the course of dealing with an emergency, it is not only their lives which are put at risk, but the lives of those they are working to protect. Now, that's a direct quote from the then Lord Advocate Colin Boyd, and that informed the government's thinking at the time this original emergency workers legislation was put through. So there is a big issue there. I really have only a few seconds to go. I'm sorry, and I did want to make the point, because it is a broader cultural one, that we do have to tackle alcohol and drug-fuelled antisocial behaviour, because a lot of what we're talking about here is generated by that. There are campaigns constantly ongoing. Prevention is important. The Scottish Business Crime Centre is crucial, as are the initiatives it promotes, and I do want to highlight some of their practical measures and the benefits they bring, and that is, for example, over 340 licensed premises now accredited under Best Bar None, a scheme to address alcohol-related crime, 400 businesses now accredited under the SBCC Safer Retail Award, and 12 major shopping centres have the Safer Shopping Award. These are schemes which will help to drive down these figures. I'm about out of time. I'm in the presiding officer's hands.
It's up to you, Minister. I can give you a short time back.
Okay.
John Wilson.
Minister, You've just given a list of figures in relation to work that's been done. Could you give an indication of what those figures are in relation to the wider retail sector? Because it's nice to say there's 300 and odd accredited, but how many does that compare to? Does that 300 odd out of 500, or is it 300 odd out of 5,000? And it's trying to get the accreditation figures to make sure that we're actually trying to attain targets that are meaningful, not just targets that look good on paper but don't have any real effect on.
Right. I mean, I'll need to send that information to the members, since I don't have it with me this evening. But I do want to point in the direction of the work with the Violence Reduction Unit, which is again about, the broader culture of violence and violent crime. I'm conscious that I'm probably well over time, so I'll skip through some of the things like cashback for communities, etc., that I've got here. Looking more broadly, Scottish Government also fund the Scottish Centre for Healthy Working Lives, and that's part and parcel of it. I was interested in some of the comments about the possibility that what's happening is that incidents are not being reported because it doesn't suit employers to have them reported, and I think there probably is a bit of an issue around there that we would need to look at quite closely. Following the previous members' debate on the safety of shop workers, the then Minister for Community Safety committed to meet USDAW to discuss their excellent work, and that meeting did take place. The Minister did show his support for their work, and I can say that this meeting resulted in USDAW participating in the SG-led Age-Restricted Products Enforcement Group. So I hope that the member will accept that the Government is as concerned about this issue as he and other members are, but it's not just quite as straightforward as it might look on the surface and does bear some closer examination. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and that concludes Hugh Henry's debate on the Protection of Workers Bill, and I now close this meeting of Parliament.